everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm back with a new video in my series Units of Total War Rise of Mordor, with the faction being looked at today being the Elven Woodland Realm. If you're new to the channel, in this series I look at a faction in the mod Rise of Mordor for the game Total War Attila, the mod linked in the description below, going over the history of the faction within the books and films of Tolkien's universe before looking at the real-life civilizations that inspired them. After that, I look at the units of the faction, discussing their battlefield role as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic the units are. Now that you understand what topics this video will cover, let's look at the history of the Woodland Realm. Originating in the eastern regions of Middle-earth by settlement of the area by the Sylvan Elves, otherwise known as the Wood Elves, the Woodland Realm as an independent kingdom was created by an elven prince known as Orofa, who intermingled with the Wood Elves in the massive forest then known as Greenwood the Great in the early Second Age. A relatively secluded kingdom compared to the other elven kingdoms, the Woodland Realm remained wary of those who lived on the borders of Greenwood, viewing not just Sauron as a threat, but also the dwarves and the elves of Lorien too. However, when Sauron returned after the destruction of Numenor and began to make war on the kingdom of Gondor to the south as his opening move to conquer Middle-earth, King Orofa and the army of the Woodland Realm joined the elves of Lorien under their leader Amdir, marching alongside the last alliance of men and elves. Despite being dedicated to beating Sauron, Orofa and Amdir's combined army was poorly equipped compared to their allies and lacked experience in warfare. This, combined with their refusal to submit to the authority of Gil-galad, the nominal leader of the elven contingents, and the High King of Lindon due to previous issues in the past, led the elves of the Woodland Realm to suffer horrific casualties against Mordor, losing a large portion of their army in futile attacks, with Orofa dying in battle as did his ally Amdir. In Orofa's place, his son Thranduil would become the king of the Woodland Realm, and would have what remained of his forces fall back to Greenwood, leaving the war effort to the others in the last alliance. With the war won, the Woodland Realm would exist in harmony for a millennia into the Third Age, when a mysterious being known as the Necromancer infiltrated Greenwood, in truth being Sauron in a lesser form, tainting its southern regions and infesting them with orcs and massive spiders, leading to the Woodland Realm repositioning itself to the northern region of Greenwood, which they now renamed Mirkwood. In their new position, the elves of the Woodland Realm would trade with the Lonely Mountain and Dale, although tension would remain between the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain and the Woodland Realm, only exacerbated by the destruction of the Lonely Mountain and Dale, when the elves refused to support their neighbours. Years later, when Thorin and his company of dwarves attempted to cross the Woodland Realm to reach the Lonely Mountain so as to kill Smaug the dragon, Thranduil had them imprisoned, something which would lead to further conflict down the line. After escaping the dungeons of the Woodland Realm and enduring a set of adventures, the dwarves found the situation at the Lonely Mountain changed, with Smaug killed by Bard the Bowman, the settlement of Laketown destroyed, and an army of the Woodland Realm marching on the mountain hoping to claim some of the treasure within it. When Thorin refused to part with even a single coin of his immense hoard, it seemed war between the company of dwarves and the allied men of Laketown and elves of the Woodland Realm was inevitable, even more so when a dwarven army led by Dane Ironfoot arrived to support the company. However, before serious fighting could break out between the various factions, they were attacked by a massive army of orcs, goblins and wargs, leading to the Battle of the Five Armies. Having faced this threat as allies rather than enemies, stronger connections were forged between the newly founded Kingdom of Dale, the Lonely Mountain, and the Woodland Realm. Near the end of the Third Age, the Woodland Realm served as the prison of the creature Gollum, with his escape being relayed to the Council of Elrond by Thranduil's son Legolas. Legolas, of course, joining the Fellowship and serving as the representative of all elves, but especially the Woodland Realm, in the quest to defeat Sauron. When the War of the Ring opened in earnest, the Woodland Realm was assaulted by forces from Dol Guldur, with the elves winning before joining up with Galadriel and marching on Dol Guldur, destroying it and permanently removing the shadow of Sauron from Mirkwood. In the aftermath of the War of the Ring, Mirkwood, now known as Eren Lasgallan, the Wood of Green Leaves, was split, with control being shared by the Woodland Realm to the north and Lorien to the south. While the Woodland Realm survived the war intact and thrived, Like all other realms in Middle-earth apart from those of men, it would fade away to become a relic of the past. With the history of the Woodland Realm and universe covered, we'll turn to its depiction in the films and the books. In both the book and film versions of The Hobbit, the elves of the Woodland Realm are depicted as a somewhat antagonistic force, being considered less wise and more dangerous than the other elves in Middle-earth, openly standing in the way of the protagonists until the Battle of the Five Armies, where they leave aside their differences to fight for survival against evil, with the rising tensions in the film actually reaching the point of open conflict between the elves and the dwarves, with many being killed before the orcs attack them. In the Lord of the Rings trilogy, both in the book and films, the Woodland Realm gets shown or spoken about very little, with the main representation of the Woodland Realm in both being Legolas, member of the Fellowship and one of the three hunters, who is retroactively a main character in the Hobbit films, despite not appearing in the book, given that within the timeline of Lord of the Rings, it'd make sense that he'd have been involved in the events of The Hobbit to some degree, being an elf who's been around for hundreds if not thousands of years. In terms of historical cultures that may have provided inspiration for the faction, there are none that really stand out as obvious, with some weapons or equipment perhaps individually drawing from a culture here or there, but nothing on a wide scale. Funnily enough, the one type of culture, or at least settlement, that I could see the Woodland Realm being close to are communities which attempt to separate themselves from wider society, and live more simple lives in tune with nature, an idea which even during Tolkien's time existed, with groups of people in Europe and the United States founding their own small communities governed by their own rules, much like how Arofa founded the Woodland Realm with the hopes of recreating the lifestyle that the elves had before the Valar found them and brought them to Aman. Another potential inspiration could have been the indigenous peoples around the globe, such as the Native American tribes and the Ainu of Japan, for example. If you can think of any other cultures that may have inspired the Woodland Realm, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. With the Woodland Realm as a faction covered, before turning to its units, I have to admit that in the current state of the mod, the faction doesn't have a very extensive unit roster, although this may change, so look at this video as a snapshot of the faction as it is right now, rather than what it will become when the mod's completed. With that out of the way, let's turn to its battlefield units, beginning with one that can be a potential general unit, the Elven King's Riders. This unit is quite obviously a heavy cavalry unit, actually being a command unit rather than shock cavalry, like a lot of other cavalry generals for other factions. Looking at the commander of the unit first and foremost, it's King Thranduil, looking much like he did in the Hobbit films. In terms of equipment, Thranduil lacks a helmet, instead wearing a circlet, which I'm assuming is meant to be his crown, a very elegant looking piece of jewellery in classic elven fashion. While it is cool to see Thranduil's face, for an officer to leave their head undefended, especially a king, is just asking to be targeted by enemies in the midst of battle. That's not to say that there weren't many leaders in history who went into battle without their faces being covered. However, almost all of those leaders wore a helmet, even if it did leave the face unprotected. Looking at the rest of his armor, he wears a very ornate breastplate, which resembles the highly etched and decorated harnesses created during the 16th century. Protecting his legs, he has what I'm assuming is a split mail skirt in traditional riders fashion, with metal folds over the top, the folds being weirdly spiky, which I feel could lead to accidentally stabbing your leg. For the rest of his body armor, underneath his breastplate he wears what I'm assuming is a leather buff coat made of black leather, buff coats being a piece of equipment that were used in the 16th and 17th centuries by soldiers as a way of protection against cuts, often being worn underneath breastplates, so it's an accurate design. Protecting his arms, Thranduil has very ornate lobstered pauldrons, while his forearms are covered in vambraces in the same style, also covering his hands with plate gauntlets. For weapons, Thranduil dual wields two elven sabres, both lacking guards, something seen historically, but both also being skeletonized, having holes carved out of the blade to reduce their weight, much like the Rohirrim and their spearheads and arrowheads. While I'm assuming the reasoning for these blades missing metal is the same as the weapons of Rohan, the Woodland Realm not having a great supply of metal within its borders, meaning measures have to be taken to stretch out what metal there is, in real life, as far as I know, blades weren't made with holes in them, at least for swords. In terms of style, these blades look much like Indo-Persian sabres, which were quite similar to the sabres used by the Ottoman Empire and southeastern European kingdoms like Hungary, all of them having an origin in the blades used on the Central Asian steppe by cultures such as the Mongols, who spread the weapon type throughout the areas they conquered, leading to many designs being inspired by them. With Thranduil's equipment looked at, let's look at the rest of his riders. For helmets, they wear ones that are quite reminiscent of barbutes, and by extension, Corinthian helmets, however being gilded with gold in certain areas, such as the border around the face and the cheek guards. Gilded helmets were used by very wealthy warriors in the Middle Ages, so for these troops to be equipped as such is true to historical trends, even if the helmets do look weird with the two extended plates on top, designed as a way of differentiating the elves of the Woodland Realm from other elven factions and their armor, which often looks quite similar between factions. Those two pieces aren't something I can see being used in real life in any meaningful way, even though I may be wrong. For the rest of their body armor, they wear robes over which they have a mail coat with gilded links, over which they have a highly ornate and gilded breastplate in the same style as Thranduil, having a gold motif rather than Thranduil's silver and black. Protecting their arms are what I'm assuming are scale segments attached to their mail armor, similar to the way mail would be attached to fabric arming doublets as a way of protecting gaps in plate armor. While their elbows are unprotected, the rest of their arms are, having plate van braces and pauldrons to protect their arms. For weapons, they wield meatier blades than Thranduil, their weapons being closer to a tulwar than a saber, a perfect weapon for slashing away at enemies. In terms of shields, they certainly are interesting. In regards to size, they're roughly equivalent to kite shields, but their shape is something more like a stretched out heater shield. All I know is that I can't for the life of me think of a shield that matches this design that really exists in real life. Looking at the shield's construction, it's wood that has been hardened to be as tough as steel according to behind the scenes footage for the Hobbit films, the wood being of a grey colour. Having the shields be wood is more accurate than the other elven shields, which tend to be completely metal. However, that accuracy goes away really quickly, as the shield is rimmed in gold and has a metal structure combined with the boss over the upper half of the shield. While the partial metal overlay covered in gold and silver looks cool, it all ultimately contributes to a non-historical, if very recognizable shield shape covered in expensive materials, which isn't a good idea for equipment expected to see service in battle. I can't say that the rims on this shield aren't historical, because the entire shield is ahistorical in my opinion. One thing to note about the shield, however, is that for heavy cavalry who are armoured akin to knights from the 16th century, having shields is a bit ahistorical, given that once armour reached this level, shields were discarded as armour could deal with enemy blows sufficiently, something you see in a lot of the units in this mod, being very heavily armoured and yet still wielding shields. Turning to their horses, they're also very heavily armoured, having barding protecting their upper neck, their chest, and the rear of the horse, only the stomach really being undefended, the head of the horse being covered in a faceplate engraved with a golden tree. Horses this heavily armoured are most definitely historically accurate, being prominently used by heavy European cavalry towards the end of the Middle Ages, as a way of making shock cavalry less susceptible to infantry equipped with spears and polearms designed to kill cavalry. While you can complain that Thranduil rides a horse rather than his megaloceros like in the Hobbit films, apart from the unnecessary extra work the mod creators would have to put in to make the model, it's also kind of inaccurate for him to have that steed, given it's killed in the Battle of the Five Armies. Moving away from the horses and looking at the unit as a whole, these guys are practically excellent in regards to body armor, being able to withstand immense amounts of damage in melee and against ranged enemies due to not only the riders being armored, but their horses too. The only real downside to the unit being that because they use swords rather than lances, they're inferior shock cavalry. However, the unit makes up for this by being able to engage enemies in drawn-out battles far more easily than shock cavalry, which tend to be glass cannons and can be picked off very quickly if not used carefully. As a general unit, I consider it the best option available to the Woodland Realm, not just because it's yet another unit led by a named and unique individual in Middle-earth, but also because it can withstand so many different types of enemies, the only ones really being effective at killing them being spears and pikes. While the unit doesn't pack quite the wallop of the other general units that are shock cavalry, when attacking enemy forces they can do more than enough damage, especially when attacking enemy units stuck in melee from the rear. A really amazing unit that I'm quite the fan of, and which I suggest be used as a general unit whenever possible, except for siege battles. Moving on from the Elven King's Riders, we go to the first and only melee infantry the faction fields, the Lasgallan Blades. These heavy infantry are the standard line swordsmen you see fighting in the Battle of the Five Armies. Their helmets are much the same as those of the Elven King's Riders, the only differences being that the helmets are coloured bronze rather than silver, with the flanges atop their helmet being slightly smaller. For body armour, they wear a mail coat under which is padded clothing, and over which they have a breastplate identical to Thranduil's, being bronze like their helmet, helping to visually separate the warriors of the Woodland Realm from the soldiers of Imladris, who tend to wear silver armour, and the troops from Lindon, who wear gold for the most part, the colours also showing the status of their civilizations, the Kingdom of Lindon being the highest elven kingdom, while its tributary Imladris takes second place, with the Woodland Realm tending to be at the bottom of the ladder in terms of importance, at least to elves. Protecting their legs, they have decorated buff coats, working in conjunction with their mail to keep them safe. Finally, protecting their arms are the same vambraces, pauldrons, and gauntlets as the Elven King's Riders. To top off the look, they have wonderful red cloaks with hoods which help make the unit look that much cooler. For swords, they use the same Tawar-shaped blade, while their shields are also the same as those of the previous unit. The only real differences being that the shields are less ornate, and that the wood used for these shields is a rich brown rather than grey. Moving to their officer, he's equipped with the same silver armour as the Elven King's Riders. However, instead of using a sabre and a shield, he wields a large two-handed blade reminiscent of the Dacian falx and the rompire, big bladed weapons used in antiquity and famous for being highly useful against the legions of the Roman Empire, negating the usefulness of their armour when used by the tribes of Dacia in their wars against the Romans. As a unit, the Lasgallan Blades are the main sword infantry of the faction, being more than a match not only for low-tier units like those used by the Orcs, but also mid- and high-tier swordsmen like the Gondorian heavy infantry swords. In melee, these troops are almost peerless, while their armour and large shields means that they're quite resistant to ranged attacks, always a good quality to be found in line infantry. When playing offensively as the Woodland Realm, these troops are very useful at cutting through enemy formations, while when on the defensive, they make for an incredibly sturdy battle line. Because the faction has no shock troops currently, these guys will have to do, while also being the main core of your forces available to storm enemy fortifications. A crucial unit for the Woodland Realm however you choose to play, and a pretty iconic unit to boot as well. Moving on from the Lasgallan Blades, we come to their spear equivalent, the only spear unit the Woodland Realm currently has, the Lasgallan Spears. Seen in the Battle of the Five Armies film, these are the main troops who fight against the armies of Dol Guldur and Mount Gundabad, being more than a match for the Orcs, but being heavily outnumbered, leading to great casualties. Equipped identically to the Lasgallan Blades, we'll skip their armour and equipment and move to the only thing they have that's different, their spears. As weapons, their spears have a long wooden shaft, over which a long metal shaft is joined with a spear tip at the end of the metal. Long metal pieces, similar to langlets, were used for spears as a way of making the shaft more durable, so the weapon's configuration is highly accurate. What isn't accurate is the spear tip, which is large and bladed, designed to both pierce and cut. That, however, isn't the issue being that the spear tips are skeletonized to such a degree, with having so many holes in them. Now, one thing I overlooked in my previous video on Rohan, and which is also applicable here, is that while there are some weapons that did have metal cutouts, they tend to be on polearms like halberds, and the amount of metal removed is quite small, also being for decoration more than anything else. Spear tips and arrows having such large holes in them isn't historic, however, so I'll stick by my statement that such weapons aren't accurate depictions. Having the same officer as the Lasgallan Blades, we'll skip him and move on to the unit role. The Lasgallan spears are the core of your army, being the spearmen who hold the line against the enemy, and who imperil their cavalry with a wall of spears. Just like their sword equivalent, their amazing armour and shields means that they can withstand melee combat exceedingly well, while ranged units tend to have a hard time inflicting meaningful damage to the unit. While the unit can't kill enemies at a fast rate like the swords, they will pin down the enemy indefinitely, eventually grinding them down or allowing your more offensive troops time to beat their opponent and to then roll the enemy line. In sieges, this unit is amazing at holding choke points and buying time, being capable of holding out even against shock troops, although victory isn't that likely when being swarmed with high-tier shock troops. Just an amazing unit overall, which is a core building block of any army of the Woodland Realm. Moving on from the Lasgallan spears, we come to the faction's only polearm infantry and second potential general unit, the Hall Guardians, seen in the desolation of Smaug serving as the guards of Thranduil's underground city. When it comes to armor, these guys are well armored, having helmets similar to those of the faction's other troops, the only differences being the lack of crests, which make their helmets look far more historically accurate, looking like an ornate bassinet from the 14th and 15th centuries with a nasal bar. Protecting their faces are masks made of fabric, not necessarily armor, but more being a way of giving the warriors in the unit anonymity or making them look more imposing. Attached to the helmets are something akin to an aventail, instead of mail, being made of multiple layers of leather, something I don't see as being very historic. Turning to their body armor, they wear a scale hauberk cinched at the waist with fabric robes over the top, the scale looking quite good and extending to cover their arms too, which is good to see. Over the top of their scale, they wear the same pauldrons and vambraces as the other units, having an accompanying green cloak as part of their uniform. Lacking a shield, they instead wield what I can only describe as a two-handed weapon, which looks very much like a fantasy-oriented glaive. While the blade shape is good, being curved to deliver more damaging slashes, the blade has massive gaps in it that are just as deserving of criticism as the previous spears. The blade is notched near the end, meaning it can trap and pull enemy weapons and even armor, while there's a vicious spike on the back, useful for piercing the gaps of armor and for dragging around enemies. Their officer is nothing special, so we'll skip him and get into the unit's role. On the battlefield, these guys are useful as a support unit, being thrown into the thick of battle when things look bad, either against entrenched infantry or cavalry, who they'll tear apart with their weapons. Due to a lack of shock troops in the unit roster, these guys help fulfill that role, which is very much appreciated. Because this unit is elite, there's a limit on how many you can bring. However, you wouldn't want an army with these guys being the main core of it. While they are good in melee combat, cavalry charges will decimate them, while archers have an easy time tearing them apart due to their lack of plate armor and shields, meaning a front line comprised of these guys is just begging to be destroyed by enemy archers. It's this same weakness that makes me consider it arguably the worst general unit the faction has, given that like all polearm units they're slow when in formation, meaning they can be focused down easily by enemy archers, and can't escape their range like cavalry can, while if they break out of formation they make themselves easy targets to cavalry. While they can punch holes in enemy lines and take advantage of situations, they're not the best choice in my opinion, although when attacking in siege battles, they do well at dismantling enemy stands, as long as you use regular Hall Guardians rather than one selected as a general. A cool unit that has its place, but should not be relied upon to be the core of the strength of the Woodland Realm. With the Hall Guardians covered, all of the Woodland Realm's melee infantry have been looked at, so we'll move on to its ranged units, beginning with the Forest Rangers. These bowmen are lightly equipped, having at most leather cuirasses and vambraces for armor, relying on stealth and camouflage as a defense instead. For head protection they have capes with hoods, as well as some face masks, good for hiding and making yourself disappear from the enemy, but not useful at blocking enemy attacks at all. Apart from their leather cuirasses, which may be able to help protect them from some melee damage, they're essentially unarmored. For weapons, they use a longbow capped with metal as their main weapon, while in case of melee combat occurring, they have tulwars similar to the Lasgallan blades, but smaller, being more akin to machetes. Their officer is equipped the same as his troops, wearing a leather cuirass and cloak like his men rather than the heavy armor of the other officers, using not a bow, but instead the same large two-handed blade as the other officers, making him a unique officer. On the battlefield, these are light skirmish troops capable of using stealth to ambush the enemy and pin them down with arrows. Keeping the enemy at range is your best option when using this unit, as they will suffer grievous casualties if engaged in melee, while their lack of armor means that while they may be more skilled than other archer units, they'll still suffer heavy casualties. As an archer unit, they are very useful, However, they can't really double as melee troops the way other archers from other factions can, nor can they be the core of your ranged power, as there's a limit on how many an army can have. I advise using them to ambush enemy forces before drawing them back to support your main archer force, as leaving them out runs the risk of them being destroyed by cavalry, a constant threat. A cool unit that serves the same ranger role as other units for other factions. However, the Woodland Realm does have heavier line archers that are more useful, in the form of the Lasgallan archers, seen being a major component of the army that fights in the Battle of the Five Armies. They're equipped identically to the Lasgallan blades and spears, not using shields and instead having the same longbows and smaller talwars as the Forest Rangers. Skipping their standard officer, this unit fulfills the role of the standard archer for the faction, helping to thin out enemy ranks before the superior infantry of the faction can destroy what remains in an infantry clash. Because these guys are heavily armoured, they can somewhat be used as melee troops once their quivers are empty, preferably attacking the enemy from the rear and flanks rather than being frontline infantry, something they're not that good at. In archery duels, they fare far better than the Forest Rangers, although their lack of shields means they're more susceptible to enemy projectiles than the other Lasgallan units. I recommend having many units in your army being these guys, occasionally being supported by the other ranged units, but always being the core of your ranged strength. Capable of facing off against other good ranged units and beating them, these guys will never let you down. Moving on from the Lasgallan archers, we come to the last of the Woodland Realm's bow units, the Lords of Lasgallan, who are the final potential general unit for the faction. In terms of appearance, these guys are mainly based off of the Lasgallan archers, having the same helmets and armor as the bowmen, but with the face masks of the Hall Guardians. That said, their breastplates are a deeper and richer brown, rather than the bronze of the Lasgallan archers, while being highly ornately decorated with gold, rather than silver or steel highlights of the Lasgallan line units. Instead of the buff coat of the Lasgallan troops protecting their legs, they have a beautiful gilded mail coat, which extends under their breastplate to provide extra protection. Similarly, the rest of their armor shares the same brown color pattern rather than bronze. For weapons, they use the longbow and short talwar, while their officer is equipped identically to his troops, just using a two-handed blade to differentiate him. As a unit, these guys are devastating, being capable of destroying enemy units in archery duels or by focusing them down, while when fighting in melee, these guys are almost as good as the line infantry of the faction, their only weaknesses being shock troops and ranged units, who can still kill them due to their lack of shields. While cavalry is generally a threat to most ranged units, lighter cavalry units aren't that dangerous to this unit, as the Lords of Lasgallan have the armor and weapons to bog down light cavalry and then destroy them or at the very least tire them down in fights, preventing them from being used elsewhere. While the unit is a cut above the Lasgallan archers, because the unit is limited, it can only be used to support your archers rather than replace them, unless you plan on only having a small but elite archer contingent. As a potential general unit, the Lords of Lasgallan are very vulnerable, being weak to heavy cavalry, archers, and shock troops. However, they do have the speed to somewhat avoid those threats, unlike the Hall Guardians, who can't. In siege battles, this unit could work well as a general, but on the open battlefield, I find it inferior to the Elven King's Riders. An amazing unit and one which buffs the powers of the faction, but not a unit that's crucial to victory in my opinion. Moving on from the Lords of Lasgallan specifically, and the Archers of the Woodland Realm overall, we come to the last unit in the faction, the Onager. The sole siege unit available to the faction, crewed by Lasgallan archers without bows. The unit is useful in that it evens the playing field for the Woodland Realm and gives it siege capabilities, something the faction needs, especially with its limited roster. By allowing holes to be punched in enemy fortifications, the faction reduces the risks of taking appalling casualties when capturing enemy strongholds, something that all Elven factions benefit from, given their small unit size. Overall as a faction, the Woodland Realm has glaring weaknesses, lacking extensive infantry options or even cavalry, apart from a single commander unit, meaning that the faction must rely on archers and spears to make up for those deficits. When playing as the Woodland Realm, the optimal strategy is to use its superior archers to hollow out enemy formations before using the superior melee abilities of its units to overpower them in battle, essentially sticking to the Elven ethos of using quality rather than quantity to win battles. A pretty cool faction, not one I'd call my favourite, but one that I nonetheless quite like. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. By the time this video drops, the new update for Rise of Mordor should have been released, so expect new videos covering the updates to be released on the channel. This is your host Jakov, signing out.